It was a quiet afternoon in the suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, and the houses lined up neatly along the streets like perfect little models of suburban life. The lawns were well manicured, the fences freshly painted, and the sidewalks clean, except for the occasional bicycle tire mark or a forgotten ball. This was a neighborhood that prided itself on order and respect, where rules were made to be followed, and the community kept its harmony. Elijah, a 10-year-old boy, was outside on one of those quiet afternoons, playing basketball with his friends. He had been dribbling the ball around the driveway, laughing and calling out to his friends, enjoying the simple pleasure of being outside. The air was warm, and the sounds of children's laughter filled the street. To most people, it was just another summer day, but for Elijah, it felt different. The afternoon was about to take a turn. Elijah's family had moved to the neighborhood only a year ago. They had found the area appealing because of the safe, peaceful atmosphere, the parks nearby, and most importantly, the good schools. Tiffany, Elijah's mother, had worked hard to give her children the best life possible. Her husband, David, had a demanding job, but they were a close-knit family, and they looked out for each other. David had been promoted to the position of FBI director earlier that year, a job he had worked toward for most of his life. While the family had enjoyed some of the perks that came with David's success, they hadn't expected any trouble from the neighbors, especially in a place like this. But that afternoon, Elijah was about to learn that things weren't always as perfect as they seemed. As he dribbled the ball, it bounced off the rim of the basket and rolled across the yard, heading straight toward the property of the next-door neighbor. Elijah didn't think much of it at first, it was just a ball. He jogged over to retrieve it, but before he could reach it, a voice interrupted him. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Elijah looked up to see Mr. Thomas Hayes, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, standing at the edge of his driveway. Hayes was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair, always well dressed in button-up shirts and slacks, a man who seemed to take great pride in his role as the HOA president. The HOA had always been a point of pride in the neighborhood, and Mr. Hayes was its enforcer. His word was law when it came to the rules of the community, and he made sure everyone followed them to the letter. "I just got my ball back, sir," Elijah said politely, standing near the edge of the lawn. "You can't just let your ball roll into someone else's yard like that. It's a violation of the community rules," Hayes snapped, his voice stern and harsh. Elijah stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had played in this neighborhood countless times, and his ball had rolled into other yards before, but no one had ever made such a big deal about it. In fact, most neighbors were understanding and would simply return the ball without complaint. But Mr. Hayes was different. He took his role seriously, sometimes too seriously. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I'll keep it on our side," Elijah said, trying to explain himself. But Hayes wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he said, taking a step forward. "You kids think you can break the rules and get away with it? Well, not in this neighborhood." Elijah, trying to remain calm, backed up a little. He had never had a problem with Mr. Hayes before, but there was something about the way he was acting now that made him nervous. Hayes, seeing Elijah's retreat, became even angrier. "You think this is a game?" Hayes shouted, reaching out and grabbing Elijah by the arm. "I don't care who you are, you're not above the rules." Elijah winced in pain as Mr. Hayes's grip tightened. The older man's face was red, his anger boiling over. Elijah tried to pull away, but Hayes wouldn't let go. In an instant, the situation escalated. Mr. Hayes raised his hand, his palm coming down hard against Elijah's cheek in a sharp slap. The sound of it echoed through the street. The force of the slap knocked Elijah to the ground, and for a moment, he just lay there, stunned. His cheek burned from the impact, and his mind struggled to process what had just happened. He had never been hit by an adult before, certainly not someone in the neighborhood, and especially not someone like Mr. Hayes. His friends, who had been watching from a distance, gasped in shock. They had never seen anything like it. They all stood frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react. But Elijah's body remained still on the ground, his face hidden behind his hands as he fought to hold back tears. Mr. Hayes, meanwhile, seemed to be calming down, his anger shifting into a more controlled, but still cold, demeanor. "Next time, remember who's in charge around here," he said, his voice low and threatening. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving Elijah lying on the ground, still in shock from the sudden, violent encounter. Elijah slowly stood up, feeling the sting on his cheek. His friends rushed to him, asking if he was okay, but Elijah didn't answer. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't even know what to say. The world felt suddenly different, colder. The neighborhood that had once seemed so friendly now felt like a place where rules were used to hurt people, where even the smallest mistake could lead to something much bigger. As Elijah walked back home, his heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't wait to tell his parents what had happened, but a part of him wasn't sure how they would react. They always told him to stay out of trouble and avoid confrontation. Would they be upset with him for letting it happen? Would they believe him? When he arrived home, he found his mother, Tiffany, in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked up and smiled, but the smile faded when she saw Elijah's face. "Elijah, what happened? Why do you look so upset?" Tiffany immediately approached her son, her face full of concern. Elijah slowly lifted his hand to his cheek, the redness still visible, and told her what had happened. Tiffany's expression changed from concern to anger. She had always taught Elijah to stand up for himself, but this was something different. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We're going to handle this," she said, her voice firm. "This is not right, Elijah. No one has the right to treat you like that." But even as she said those words, a sense of fear lingered in her chest. She knew that things like this could get complicated, especially when powerful people were involved. Mr. Hayes was no ordinary man in the neighborhood. He was a figure of authority, someone who could make life difficult for anyone who stood in his way. Tiffany sat down with Elijah and held his hand, silently vowing to protect him no matter what. The next steps were clear: she would make sure the truth came out, no matter who was standing in her way. After the incident with Mr. Hayes, things started to change quickly for the family. David, as the FBI director, had always kept his professional life separate from his personal life. His job required a level of discipline, control, and a calm demeanor in high-stress situations. But this time, it was different. This time, it was his son, and that made everything personal. David sat in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. His mind wasn't on the documents or the meetings he had scheduled for the day. He kept thinking about Elijah. He had never seen his son like this before. Elijah, normally energetic and full of life, had been quieter in the days after the incident. He didn't speak much, even when his friends came by, and he avoided looking anyone in the eye. It hurt David to see him like this. His son was suffering, and it was because of one man's reckless behavior. A man who held power in the neighborhood and had used that power to hurt Elijah. David knew he couldn't sit idly by. He had the resources, the connections, and the ability to make things right. But there were other things at play, things far beyond his control. Mr. Hayes wasn't just some random neighbor. He was the HOA president, a position that held a great deal of influence in the community. People looked up to him, trusted him. And in a way, that made David even more determined to make sure the truth came out. If Mr. Hayes could do this to Elijah and get away with it, what did that say about the rest of the community? What would stop other people from taking advantage of their power? David leaned back in his chair and picked up the phone. He called a few of his trusted colleagues from the FBI. "I need your help with something," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. He didn't want this to turn into a public spectacle. He wanted to gather information quietly, without making any waves just yet. He needed to understand Mr. Hayes better, to dig into his past, to see if there was a pattern of behavior, something that could support Elijah's case. His colleagues agreed to help, and over the next few days, David's team began their investigation. They started gathering information about Mr. Hayes, his background, and his history in the neighborhood. It wasn't long before they discovered troubling details. Mr. Hayes had been the HOA president for years and had a reputation for being strict, perhaps even too strict, about the rules. Some people respected him for it, believing that order and discipline were necessary to keep the community running smoothly. Others, however, had felt the sting of his overbearing ways. He had been involved in disputes with neighbors before, always using his position to put pressure on those who didn't follow the rules to his exact specifications. One of David's colleagues found records of a previous complaint against Mr. Hayes, a neighbor who had accused him of harassment for reporting a trivial violation to the HOA that had resulted in significant fines. There were also rumors of Mr. Hayes using his position to manipulate situations for personal gain. These were all pieces of the puzzle that David needed. He wasn't surprised by what he was learning, but he was becoming angrier. How could someone in such a position of power abuse it in such a way? Meanwhile, Tiffany was dealing with her own set of challenges. She had always been a protective mother, but she wasn't sure how to approach the situation. Elijah was her first priority, and seeing him struggle in the aftermath of the attack was breaking her heart. She had always taught her children to be strong, to stand up for themselves when they were wronged, but this was different. Elijah had been hurt, and no amount of teaching could prepare him for the kind of pain he was feeling. Tiffany sat down with her son one evening after dinner. She noticed how distant Elijah had become over the past few days. He no longer ran around the house, excited to talk about his day or tell her about the things he had learned at school. He was quiet, withdrawn. It was as if he was carrying a weight on his shoulders. "Elijah," Tiffany said gently, sitting beside him on the couch, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Elijah nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor. He didn't want to talk about what had happened. He didn't want to think about it. He just wanted things to go back to normal. "I know you're upset, sweetheart," Tiffany continued, her voice filled with compassion. "But you don't have to carry this alone. Your dad and I are here for you. We'll figure this out together." Tears filled Elijah's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. He wasn't used to crying, not in front of anyone, especially his mother. He had always been the strong one, the one who took care of his little sister, the one who helped out around the house. But now, he felt small. He felt weak. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, Mom," Elijah whispered. I just wanted to play. I didn't think it would turn into something like this." Tiffany hugged him tightly, her heart aching for her son. "You didn't do anything wrong, Elijah. Not one thing. Mr. Hayes was wrong. He was the one who crossed the line. And we're going to make sure he's held accountable for what he did." As Tiffany comforted Elijah, David was taking his own steps to ensure that the truth would come to light. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Mr. Hayes had connections. He had influence. And there would undoubtedly be people who would stand by him, people who would justify his actions. But David didn't care. This wasn't about politics or power. This was about doing the right thing for his son. David decided it was time to go public. He wanted the community to know what had happened, to understand that what Mr. Hayes had done was not acceptable. Tiffany wasn't sure about making it public just yet, worried about the backlash they might face, but David was resolute. We have to stand up for Elijah, David said firmly. This is bigger than just the two of us. It's about making sure that no one else ever has to go through something like this. We can't stay silent. Together, they decided to contact a local newspaper, hoping that the media would help bring attention to the case. Tiffany wasn't sure how the community would react. Some people might be supportive, while others might side with Mr. Hayes. But they both knew they had to do what was right, even if it meant facing resistance from their neighbors. A reporter came to their home the next day. She listened carefully as Tiffany and David shared their side of the story, telling her about the incident with Mr. Hayes, about the slap, about the way Elijah had been treated. The reporter promised to write an article that would make sure their voice was heard. The article was published the following week, and it spread quickly. People in the neighborhood began talking. Some were appalled by Mr. Hayes's actions, while others defended him, insisting that Elijah must have done something to provoke the situation. The community was divided, and tensions began to rise. But David and Tiffany remained focused. They knew that the fight wasn't over. They had made a decision to stand up for their son, and they were prepared to face whatever came their way. The truth was on their side, and they would make sure it was heard. The days following the confrontation between Elijah and Mr. Hayes were filled with tension. The neighborhood, once a peaceful and quiet place, had become a battleground. People who had always been friendly were now divided. Some sided with Mr. Hayes, believing that his actions were justified in maintaining order and discipline in the neighborhood. Others, like Elijah's family, were determined to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Tiffany, Elijah's mother, couldn't shake the anger she felt about what had happened. It wasn't just the slap that hurt her, it was the realization that her son, her sweet, innocent child, had been treated this way simply because of a small mistake. She had always tried to protect him from the harsh realities of the world, but now, she couldn't hide the truth any longer. She could see the fear in Elijah's eyes, the way he had flinched when people raised their voices, the way he had pulled away from his friends in the days after the incident. Tiffany knew she had to act. She couldn't let this slide. She needed to make sure Elijah's voice was heard. The anger she felt was now replaced by determination. She made a decision that day: she would not be silent. She would fight for her son, no matter the consequences. David, her husband, had always been a quiet and serious man. As the FBI director, he was used to dealing with high-stakes situations, and he was no stranger to pressure. But this was personal. Elijah was his son, and the thought of someone treating his child in such a violent way made his blood boil. He had seen injustice before, but this was different. This wasn't just some case. This was his family. David knew that things would escalate quickly. The moment they made their complaints public, Mr. Hayes would probably try to cover up the incident. He would use his position as HOA president to sway the opinions of the community. David didn't care about his position. What mattered was the truth, and Elijah deserved justice. That night, David called a meeting with a few of his trusted colleagues from the FBI. He explained the situation in detail, leaving out no part of the story. He wanted them to understand how serious this was, not just for Elijah, but for the entire community. If people saw that someone like Mr. Hayes could get away with something like this, they would begin to believe that power could be used to hurt others without consequences. That was the kind of world they lived in, and David wouldn't stand for it. The next morning, David and Tiffany sat down with Elijah, who had been unusually quiet since the incident. They wanted to hear how he was feeling and if he had any thoughts about what had happened. Elijah, still shaken, had trouble putting his feelings into words. He told them that he felt embarrassed, that he wished he hadn't played in front of Mr. Hayes at all. He worried that everyone in the neighborhood would think he had done something wrong. He even wondered if his friends would stop talking to him. Tiffany hugged him tightly. "Elijah, you didn't do anything wrong. What Mr. Hayes did was completely wrong, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that. You're not alone in this. David added, we're going to take action. No one should have the power to treat people like that, especially not someone in a position of authority. You're brave, Elijah. And we're going to fight for you. As the family discussed the next steps, the word about the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood. People started asking questions. The once peaceful community now felt like it was split down the middle. Some were sympathetic toward Elijah, while others stood by Mr. Hayes, arguing that he had only been trying to maintain order. But there were also whispers that Mr. Hayes had a history of being overly strict, of using his position to push people around. The truth was starting to come to light. Tiffany decided to reach out to the local newspaper, hoping that the media could help bring attention to the case. She didn't want this to become just another small incident that people would forget. She wanted the community to understand that what had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was an act of aggression that shouldn't be tolerated. The reporter who came to their home was kind and understanding, and she took the time to listen to Elijah's side of the story. Elijah, though nervous, spoke honestly about the incident. He explained how Mr. Hayes had grabbed him, slapped him, and how his world had felt like it was falling apart in that moment. The reporter promised to write a story, one that would make sure Elijah's voice was heard. The following days were filled with interviews and phone calls. David's colleagues at the FBI worked behind the scenes, gathering evidence and digging into Mr. Hayes's background. They uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Mr. Hayes had been involved in several similar incidents over the years, each time using his position as HOA president to silence anyone who complained. It was clear that this wasn't just a random act of aggression, it was part of a larger problem. The neighborhood began to take sides. People who had previously stayed out of the conflict were now speaking up, either in support of Elijah or defending Mr. Hayes. Some residents criticized Elijah's family for bringing the issue to the media, accusing them of making a mountain out of a molehill. Others argued that the incident was a sign of deeper issues within the community that needed to be addressed. David and Tiffany tried to stay focused on their mission. They knew that this wasn't just about one slap. It was about the principle of justice, about making sure that no one could use their position to bully and intimidate others. They weren't just fighting for Elijah, they were fighting for the entire neighborhood, for anyone who had ever been mistreated or overlooked. Despite the growing division in the neighborhood, Elijah's family was determined to see this through. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be people who would try to silence them, people who would call them troublemakers. But they didn't care. They had made a promise to each other to stand up for what was right, and they would see it through, no matter the cost. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure continued to build. The story about the attack on Elijah went viral, sparking debates and protests in other cities. People from all over the country reached out to offer their support. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated by those in power. Others offered financial assistance to help with legal fees. The case had become bigger than just Elijah, it had become a symbol of the fight against injustice and abuse of power. But amidst the growing support, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. The HOA board members, who had always backed Mr. Hayes, now found themselves at odds with their own neighbors. Some resigned in protest, unwilling to stand by a man they no longer trusted. Others doubled down, defending Hayes's actions and blaming Elijah for making a fuss over nothing. Through all of this, Elijah stayed quiet, still processing everything that had happened. It was hard for him to understand why people were arguing about something that seemed so simple to him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just been playing outside, enjoying his day. Yet here he was, at the center of a storm. Tiffany and David knew that the battle wasn't over. But they also knew that they were on the right side of history. They had made the decision to stand up for their son, to make sure that Mr. Hayes faced the consequences of his actions. They weren't backing down, not now, not ever. The battle for justice was just beginning. The legal battle was beginning to gain momentum. After the article about Elijah's situation was published, the neighborhood became divided, and the pressure on David and Tiffany's family grew. While some residents rallied behind them, others sided with Mr. Hayes, dismissing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding. However, David knew that they couldn't let the situation slide. It wasn't just about their family anymore, it was about sending a message that injustice should never be tolerated, especially from someone in a position of power. As the case moved forward, David found himself pulled in many directions. Being the FBI director meant that he was already under constant scrutiny, but now, the pressure had multiplied. His colleagues and fellow law enforcement officers were divided on the issue. Some offered support, understanding the importance of standing up for what was right. But there were others who saw it as a distraction, a family matter that could hurt his career and reputation. David tried to block out the whispers and focus on the task at hand, but it was difficult. The weight of both his professional responsibilities and his personal emotions was becoming harder to manage. Tiffany, too, felt the weight of their decision. She had always been a strong and supportive mother, but now she was facing criticism from people who didn't understand why they were pursuing the case so publicly. Many people in the neighborhood whispered behind her back, questioning why she was bringing shame to their community. They said that Elijah should have just accepted the apology, that it wasn't a big deal. But Tiffany wasn't going to let them dismiss what had happened. She knew that if they didn't stand up for Elijah now, nothing would change. People like Mr. Hayes would continue to bully and intimidate others, using their power to control and manipulate. One evening, Tiffany and David sat down together in the living room after the kids had gone to bed. The tension between them had been growing, not because of any conflict between them, but because they were both exhausted. The stress of the case, the constant media attention, and the pressure from the neighborhood were beginning to take a toll. David could see that Tiffany was trying to stay strong for Elijah, but he could tell that she was struggling too. "We're doing the right thing, David," Tiffany said softly, breaking the silence. "But I can't help but feel like we're fighting a battle that might be too big. The neighborhood is so divided. I've heard people say things about Elijah that aren't true, and it's hard not to let it get to me." David reached over and took her hand in his. "I know, Tiffany. It's hard. But if we don't fight for Elijah, then who will? If we back down now, we'll just be teaching him that it's okay to let people walk all over you when they're in a position of power." Tiffany nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I just hate seeing him like this. He's so quiet now, so different. He doesn't smile the way he used to. He doesn't run around with his friends anymore. And I can tell he's scared. He's scared that people won't believe him, that they'll think he deserved what happened." David squeezed her hand. "We're going to make sure that everyone knows the truth, Tiffany. Elijah is going to come out of this stronger than ever. He's already showing bravery that most adults would never have. We can't let this slide." The next few weeks were filled with a whirlwind of legal proceedings. David's team at the FBI worked behind the scenes, gathering evidence against Mr. Hayes. They interviewed witnesses who had seen the confrontation, and they discovered more details about Mr. Hayes's past. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Mr. Hayes had a history of using his position as HOA president to intimidate and manipulate people. Several residents had come forward, recalling times when he had been overzealous in enforcing rules, often punishing minor infractions with heavy fines or threats of eviction. One woman even described how Mr. Hayes had tried to force her to sell her property, threatening to withhold her HOA membership if she didn't comply. As the investigation progressed, David felt more confident that they could bring Mr. Hayes to justice. But there was still one major hurdle: the trial. The media attention surrounding the case was only growing, and the public was divided. Some saw Elijah as a victim who deserved justice, while others believed that Mr. Hayes was just doing his job and shouldn't be vilified for one mistake. David knew that the courtroom would be the ultimate test. This was where they would either secure justice for Elijah or face a harsh setback. And the stakes were high not just for Elijah's future, but for the message it would send to the rest of the community. On the day of the trial, David and Tiffany sat in the courtroom, surrounded by their lawyers and family. Elijah, still shaken from the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks, sat quietly between them. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, and his eyes were fixed on the floor. He wasn't ready to face the world just yet. But he was there, and that was something. The courtroom was filled with people, some there to support Elijah, others there to defend Mr. Hayes. The tension in the room was palpable, and David could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a case about Elijah, it was about whether power could be used to hurt others without consequence. It was about standing up to injustice, even when the odds seemed impossible. Mr. Hayes entered the courtroom, flanked by his own team of lawyers. He looked calm, almost smug, as he took his seat on the opposite side of the room. David couldn't help but feel a wave of anger rise within him. He had never trusted Mr. Hayes, but now, seeing him sitting there like nothing had happened, David could barely contain his fury. The trial began, and the prosecution presented their case. They outlined the events of the day Elijah was attacked, presenting the evidence gathered by the FBI and eyewitness testimony. They painted a picture of Mr. Hayes as a man who had abused his position of power to intimidate and hurt a child. Mr. Hayes's defense team countered, arguing that the confrontation had been a misunderstanding. They claimed that Mr. Hayes had acted out of frustration, but that the situation had been blown out of proportion. They tried to paint Elijah as the aggressor, suggesting that he had provoked Mr. Hayes by not following the rules. But the more they spoke, the more the truth became clear. It was impossible to deny that Mr. Hayes had crossed the line. As the trial went on, David felt a sense of relief. It was clear that the evidence was on their side, and the jury was beginning to see through Mr. Hayes's defense. But there was still one final step. The judge would have to make a ruling, and David knew that it wouldn't be an easy decision. Mr. Hayes had powerful connections, and it was possible that the judge would be swayed by pressure from the community. The waiting was the hardest part. David sat quietly, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Elijah, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. For the first time in weeks, he looked up and met his father's gaze. "It's going to be okay, Dad," Elijah said softly. "I'm not scared anymore." David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You've already shown so much bravery, Elijah. No matter what happens, you're already a hero." The room fell silent as the judge prepared to make his decision. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the moment that would change everything. The trial had ended, but the waiting was far from over. The courtroom had cleared, and the day's tension still hung in the air like a thick fog. For David and Tiffany, the hardest part now was the silence. They knew the judge would take time to review the evidence, deliberate, and eventually make his ruling. But every passing hour felt like a lifetime. Elijah, who had been so quiet throughout the whole ordeal, seemed to feel it the most. The stress and weight of the entire situation were starting to show on his young face, though he tried to stay brave. At home that evening, David and Tiffany sat in the living room, talking quietly. They didn't need to say much to each other. They both knew the significance of what had just happened. They had taken a stand, not just for their son, but for every person who had ever been bullied or mistreated by someone in a position of power. But no matter how much they had prepared themselves, the reality of what had happened was starting to settle in. They had gone public with their fight, and now there was no turning back. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking deep in thought. "It's strange, isn't it? How something like this can turn your world upside down," he said softly. His voice wasn't the calm, collected one that everyone at the FBI was used to hearing. It was the voice of a father who had just watched his son go through something no child should have to face. Tiffany nodded, squeezing his hand. I never thought it would come to this. I never imagined it would be like this for Elijah. He's so different now. It's like something inside him has changed. David sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I think he's just trying to make sense of everything. This has been so hard for him. He's just a kid. But what he's going through now, what we're all going through, it'll make him stronger. He'll learn from this. I hope you're right, Tiffany whispered. I don't want him to lose that spark. He's been so brave, but I can see it in his eyes. He's carrying so much pain. The following day was filled with more waiting. The community, still divided from the media coverage and public debates, watched as the family prepared for what could be a turning point in their fight for justice. The courtroom drama had caught everyone's attention. Elijah was no longer just the boy who had been slapped by Mr. Hayes. He had become a symbol of standing up for what was right, a beacon of bravery for those who had been wronged. While the family waited, their lawyers were working tirelessly behind the scenes, making sure that every detail of the case was in order. The evidence was solid. The testimonies had been compelling. But as much as they had hope, there was always that lingering doubt. What if the judge decided that the punishment didn't fit the crime? What if they couldn't win? Then came the call. David's phone rang early in the morning, and when he saw the caller ID, his heart skipped a beat. It was the judge's office. Tiffany was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast when she saw the expression on David's face. She knew immediately. The weight of the call had been too much for him to hide. David answered the phone, his voice steady but with a hint of anxiety. Yes, this is David Hayes. What is it? The next few moments felt like a blur, but Tiffany could make out the words clearly. The judge had reached his decision. Mr. Hayes would be held accountable for his actions. He would face charges for assault and misconduct, and he would be removed from his position as HOA president. The judge's ruling was a victory, not just for Elijah but for the entire community. It was a clear message that no one, no matter their position of power, was above the law. When David hung up the phone, he stood in silence for a moment, trying to process the weight of the news. Then he turned to Tiffany, his face breaking into a smile. We did it. He's going to be held accountable. Tiffany's heart swelled with relief. She rushed over to him and hugged him tightly. Oh, David, this is it. We've won. They shared a quiet moment, embracing each other as the weight of the past few weeks lifted from their shoulders. But even in the joy of the moment, there was still the question of what would happen next. The community was still deeply divided, and Mr. Hayes still had his supporters. There would be more challenges to face. But for now, the family had achieved something important. They had stood up for what was right, and their voices had been heard. Elijah, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, looking out the window, turned toward his parents when he saw them embrace. He hadn't spoken much in the days since the trial, but today something in his eyes had changed. He was still the same boy who had been hurt, but now he carried a sense of pride in himself. He walked over to his parents, his step slow but deliberate, and when he reached them, he stood still for a moment, unsure of what to say. David knelt down to his son's level and smiled. How do you feel, buddy? Elijah hesitated, then smiled back. I feel like I'm not afraid anymore. Like I did the right thing. Tiffany's eyes filled with tears. You did, Elijah. You did the right thing. We're so proud of you. Elijah looked at both of his parents, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always looked up to his father, a man who seemed so strong and unshakable. But now, Elijah knew something that was even more important. True strength came from standing up for others, no matter the cost. He had seen that in his father and mother. He had felt it in his own heart. The community, while still divided, began to change in subtle ways. Some people reached out to Elijah's family, offering support and apologies. Others, who had initially sided with Mr. Hayes, started to see the truth. They realized that standing up for what was right wasn't just about a legal victory, it was about respecting each other, regardless of race, background, or position. As the days passed, Mr. Hayes was forced to step down as HOA president, and a new leadership took over. They promised to implement new policies that would ensure fairness and equality for everyone in the neighborhood, no matter their standing in the community. The changes weren't immediate, and the healing process was slow, but Elijah's family knew they had played a part in making things better. For Elijah, life began to return to some sense of normalcy. He played basketball with his friends again, his laughter filling the air, just as it had before. But now, there was a quiet confidence in him that hadn't been there before. He had learned something invaluable: standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it is always worth it. And in the end, it's not just about winning a case, it's about finding the strength to be yourself and fight for justice, no matter the odds.